Today, I'd like to go over a problem within the domain of multicultural education, specifically the underrepresentation of marginalized populations within gifted programs. So as far as what I'll cover today, I'd like to begin by discussing the multicultural lens, gifted education, then dive into the problem of underrepresentation, including some factors that are part of that problem and potential solutions to each of those factors. After that, I would like to end with how you can help fix this issue and my references. So what is multiculturalism and why does it exist? The context is that, as described by Lim and Renshaw, that globalization and the rise of the information age has made us more interconnected than ever, which means we're communicating across cultures and we're dependent on each other more than we've ever been. So the purpose of multiculturalism is really to understand and support cooperation and respect in this intercultural world. Now, specifically focusing on multicultural education, it's designed to both cultivate acceptance of diversity and to support the creation of equitable learning systems so that all students can flourish. Now, gifted education is designed to provide specially designed instruction to meet the needs of a gifted student. This is a direct quote from Pennsylvania Chapter 16, Special Education for Gifted Services, which is the state in which I live. And it's one of the many states that provides gifted services to students. So how do multicultural education and gifted education align? Ford, Grantham, and Whiting, 2008, created this basic framework to illustrate kind of the roles that these two forms of education play in supporting culturally and linguistically diverse students. So we can see that we need to support not only the academic processes of students who are gifted and culturally and linguistically diverse, we also need to support their cognitive and affective development and regulation, as well as respect and integrate their sociocultural perspectives and histories as well. So the problem we come to, and the reason I selected this topic, is that as you can see, Ford and King 2014 pulled this table from the US Department of Education, and this really illustrates the problem very well. This shows that in 2006, 2009, and 2011, that the underrepresentation of Black students in gifted programs were 47%, 43%, and again, 47% respectively. Now, underrepresentation is not just an issue for Black students, but it is certainly they're one of the most underrepresented groups. So we can also think of Latinx students and other marginalized groups who are often also underrepresented. So what causes this problem? The first factor that plays into this underrepresentation is our existing dominant paradigms. So Ford 2010 identifies three intertwined paradigms, and those are deficit thinking, colorblindness, and white privilege. So deficit thinking refers to the idea that other cultural groups' ways of thinking and being are inadequate, or somehow because they are different, they are not as good. Colorblindness refers to the willful ignoring of culture and cultural differences and similarities, which really takes away from both the student experience in schools and from our ability to best serve students in a way that respects their backgrounds and the way that they construct knowledge. Finally, white privilege refers to the existing hegemonic power structure in our society that privileges certain cultures over others, specifically white heteronormative men over other groups, both culturally and otherwise. So those three paradigms intertwined negatively impact representation, or equal, I should say, or equitable representation in gifted programs. So what are some potential solutions? Rodriguez, 1998, in their article about the importance of socio-transformative constructivism, argues that we should practice reflexivity, which is the process of identifying one's own cultural perspective and biases, because only once we awake to that, once we go through this process of conscientization, as noted by Wink 2011? Are we able to identify our positionality and how that might impact the way we view others? The other piece of this is avoiding over-reliance on self-reference criterion, which is really self-reference criterion refers to the ways in which we judge others based on our own cultural perspective. So again, thinking about on the last slide, deficit thinking, that comes from most likely self-reference criterion and over-reliance on that. So if we can take a step back and understand that our own cultural perspective is one of many legitimate perspectives that can help us reflect on that. And ultimately, like it says at the bottom there, consider who we are recommending for gifted programs. And instead of looking at giftedness in students who have the similar cultural perspectives, we can broaden our scope and identify students across cultural bounds. The second factor involved in this underrepresentation is screening and evaluation practices, which I was sort of alluding to there on the last slide. And specifically, Card and Giuliano, 2016, note the limitations of the parent-teacher referral systems. So in most gifted programs, at least in Pennsylvania, I can say, referrals are largely left to teachers and parents. And although teachers and parents certainly know students better than probably anyone else in the school system, there can be some issues with this. So again, we come back to over-reliance on self-reference criterion. This, especially for teachers, this sometimes implicit bias where we look at students who have similar cultural backgrounds as us and similar perspectives and identify them for gifted services. Secondly, sometimes we rely on selective screening, which again is an issue when you're only selecting certain students, because then you're likely to be influenced by your own positionality and screen students who are lining up with your own cultural position. So what are potential solutions to this? First, Card and Giuliano note that universal screening for all students would be the first step, right? Making sure that all students early in their academic careers and throughout are able to be tested, at least in a preliminary way, to see if they would qualify for gifted services. Now, Peters, Carter, and Plucker note that there are some specific practices within the way we evaluate students that we should revise in order to make evaluation testing more inclusive. The first is they note that it's important to focus on needs and services rather than labels. So instead of looking student by student and saying, are they gifted, which is focusing on the label, we should focus on their needs and the services that they require to meet those needs. So if a student, for example, is bored in class, we might assume different things about that student based on their cultural background. Instead, if their needs are not being met, if they're bored in class, we should consider if gifted services would be appropriate, and oftentimes they are. The other piece of these approaches to evaluation is the use of locally normative data instead of nationally normative data. And what that means is that, particularly for students in schools that are within communities that would be classified as lower socioeconomically, we need to consider that relative performance within that school is probably more important than student performance in that school relative to student performance nationwide, right? Because all of those other barriers that come into play for students in low socioeconomic communities are going to keep them from necessarily achieving at the level they could. But still, they would qualify for gifted services if all of those other factors were taken away. So those are the two pieces of the approaches to evaluation that Peters, Carter, and Plucker believe we should revise. And then Banks 2016 provides 5 components of multicultural education that he believes are essential. So we have content integration, integrating content from multiple cultural perspectives and backgrounds. We have discussion of the knowledge construction process and how the dominant culture shapes our understanding of ourselves and our world. We have prejudice reduction, which is pretty self-explanatory. We have the creation of an empowering community in which all students can take ownership of their learning and pursue their individual goals. And then finally, we have an equity pedagogy in which all students have access and opportunities to learn regardless of their cultural background. And then finally, we have transformative learning, described by Wink as the process of taking our learning out into our community to improve community standards or our own lives. And this has the ultimate goal of allowing students to take ownership of their learning, helping them take academic risks, and allowing them to realize the potential of their own actions. So now we get finally to what you can do. Wink 2011 provides us with a reflective cycle that can be used to improve problems within the domain of multicultural education. And this cycle begins with first focusing on a problem, identifying what that problem is. So in your own context, whether you're a parent or a teacher or some other stakeholder, consider how underrepresentation in gifted programs is playing out. Focus on that problem and then describe it. Analyze it, really identify the factors that are at play in your context. The two factors I reviewed are not the only factors, but they are two big ones. Then interpret those factors, interpret how they all fit together, and kind of go back to a broad brushstroke of the problem. And then finally, plan some action that can be taken to resolve this problem. So that action could be requesting universal screening. It could be starting conversations with other stakeholders. It really depends on how you identify the problem in your own context. So I hope this was a helpful presentation. I hope you learned something from it. And I hope that it inspires you to take some action in your own context to help alleviate this problem. Now, here are my references. So if you'd like to dig deeper into any of these, please feel free to pause the video and check those out.